Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. I remember the exact moment he left. The door didn't slam. It clicked shut, quiet and deliberate. Almost as if he wanted to erase the sound, the proof of his departure. As if, by leaving like a ghost, he could pretend we had never existed. I was still in my hospital gown, stitches raw, our son wrapped in my arms. A nurse had just left the room when he stood up from the chair in the corner, the one he had barely touched since my contractions started. "I can't do this," he had whispered, his voice detached, already halfway out the door in his mind. I don't remember what I said. Maybe I begged. Maybe I sat there in stunned silence. I do remember the way his eyes looked when he turned to go. Not guilty, not regretful, just determined. And then he was gone. First I thought he'd come back. Maybe not that night, but in a week, a month. Surely, a man couldn't just abandon his own child and walk away without looking back. I was wrong. But what he didn't know, what he could never have predicted, was that this choice, his clean, calculated disappearance, would be the exact thing that made us unforgettable. He had spent his whole life fighting for fame, for power. And I had spent mine learning how to survive without it. So when the cameras turned toward me years later, when the world wanted to hear my story, I knew one thing for certain. He would regret every second of the day he walked away. The first year was brutal. I was drowning in medical bills, exhausted beyond human limits, and utterly alone. My parents had passed years before, and my closest friends had their own lives, their own families. I was supposed to have a partner in this. But instead, I spent sleepless nights rocking my son to sleep, whispering stories of a father who didn't exist. First I tried to reach out. Not to beg him to return. I had more dignity than that. But to let him know. To tell him about the first time our son smiled. The first time he wrapped his tiny fingers around mine. I sent emails, messages. They went unanswered. Then, one day, his number was disconnected. His account's gone. He had erased us. So I made a choice. If he could erase me, I could rewrite myself. I started a blog, not expecting much. Just a place to spill my thoughts, to document the journey of being a single mother. I wrote raw, honest posts about the exhaustion, the terror, the small victories that felt like miracles. The blog turned into something bigger than I had imagined. Women from all over the world, single mothers, abandoned partners, struggling parents, began to write back. And then one day a post went viral. It was a letter titled "To the Father Who Chose to Disappear." It wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter. It was just honest. I wrote about the night he left. About the weight of silence. The cold sting of abandonment. But more than that, I wrote about what came after. How I had found strength in the absence of his love. How our son, despite everything, was thriving. A week later, I woke up to thousands of emails. Publishers reached out. Journalists wanted interviews. My following exploded overnight. And that was when the real transformation began. The book deal came first. I poured my heart into the pages, reliving every moment with brutal honesty. The nights I cried myself to sleep. The days I wanted to give up, the slow, steady realization that I had more strength than I ever imagined. When The Mother Who Stayed hit shelves, it became an instant bestseller. Suddenly, I wasn't just a single mother with a blog. I was a voice, a movement. People wanted to hear my story. They wanted to see the woman who had taken abandonment and turned it into a global conversation. And so, one by one, the invitations came. Speaking engagements, interviews, a TED Talk that garnered millions of views in days. But nothing, compared to the moment I was invited to the evening show with Rebecca Langston. This wasn't just any interview. It was the interview. Rebecca Langston was a powerhouse journalist, the kind who could make or break careers with a single question. Millions tuned into her show every night. If you sat across from Rebecca, you weren't just sharing your story. You were making history. I was nervous, of course. Not about telling my story. I had told it so many times by now, I could say it in my sleep. No, the nerves came from something else. A nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, as if this night held something more than I was prepared for. I should have listened to that feeling. Because I had no idea what was waiting for me. The studio lights were blinding. The audience hummed with anticipation. The show had been heavily promoted, and I knew why. People wanted to see the woman who had built an empire from nothing. They wanted to hear, in my own words, what it was like to be left and to rise. Rebecca greeted me with a warm smile as the cameras rolled. "Tonight," she began, "we have a woman whose story has captivated the world. A mother who turned pain into power. Please welcome Sarah Daniels." Applause thundered through the studio. I smiled, waving, my heart pounding. The interview started smoothly. Rebecca asked about my journey, about how I had built my brand, how I had found strength after abandonment. And then, somewhere near the end, her expression shifted. "Sarah," she said, pausing just long enough to make the audience lean in, "before we wrap up, there's something we wanted to do. A surprise, if you will." My pulse spiked. A surprise. I forced a smile. "All right," I said cautiously. "What kind of surprise?" Rebecca's lips curved into something between a smirk and a knowing grin. Then she turned toward the side of the stage. "We reached out to someone from your past," she said smoothly. "Someone who has something to say." The air in my lungs froze. No, it couldn't be. But then the curtain shifted. A figure stepped forward. And there he was. The man who had walked out of that hospital room years ago. The man who had vanished without a trace. My ex-husband, the father of my child, standing before me live on national television. And for the first time in years he was looking at me. But it wasn't regret I saw in his eyes. It was fear. For a moment the world stopped. The audience gasped. The camera lights blurred. The applause had faded into a stunned silence. And all I could hear was the dull, distant roar of my own heartbeat. There he was. The man who had left me broken, who had abandoned his own son, standing under the studio lights like he belonged there. I couldn't move. "Sarah," Rebecca's voice cut through the fog in my mind. "I know this is a shock, but we felt it was important to give him a chance to." I held up my hand. My eyes never left him. "You felt it was important." My voice was low, measured, but a storm was rising in my chest. "You thought I needed this." Rebecca hesitated. This wasn't going how she expected, but I wasn't here to make her comfortable. I turned back to him. The father of my child. The man who had once been my husband. He was thinner than I remembered. His jaw was sharper, his hair peppered with gray. The years had not been as kind to him as they had been to me. But the fear in his eyes, that was new. And suddenly it hit me. This wasn't his moment. This wasn't a grand romantic reunion, or a heart-wrenching apology. This was his last chance. I leaned back, crossing my arms, letting the silence stretch unbearably between us. I wouldn't give him an easy way in. If he wanted to speak, he'd have to earn it. Finally, he cleared his throat. His voice was strained, a little hoarse. "Sarah," he said. I raised a hand. "Before you start," I interrupted, tilting my head. "Are you here to apologize? Or to fix your reputation?" A murmur spread through the audience. He flinched, barely noticeable, but I caught it. He hadn't expected this. He had expected me to cry, to tremble, to break. But I wasn't the woman he had left. I was someone else now. Someone unshakable. His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "I know that. I was young, I was scared, and No, my voice was steady, steel-cut. You weren't young. You were a grown man. You were powerful. You had choices. I was young. And I didn't get to run away." A ripple of applause broke out in the audience. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to recalibrate. "You have every right to be angry," he said. I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Oh, sweetheart," I said smoothly. "Anger is such a small word for what I felt." Rebecca shifted in her chair, realizing she had lost control of the segment. This wasn't an emotional reunion. It was a reckoning. I could see him trying to regain composure. He glanced at the cameras, at the watching audience, and I saw the flicker of realization cross his face. He wasn't here to make amends. He was here to survive. I tilted my head, my voice deceptively light. Let's be honest with each other, shall we? You didn't come here because you care. You came here because you're desperate. A flicker of something crossed his expression. Guilt, shame, or just anger that he had been exposed. Your name has been trending for weeks, I continued, my voice sharper now. Not because of me, I never named you. I could have, but I didn't. I paused, letting my words sink in. You trended because people started recognizing you in my story. And they started digging. Didn't they? His silence was all the confirmation I needed. Oh, but that's not the worst part, is it? I leaned forward, my voice now ice cold. The worst part is that they found more than just me. His breath hitched, barely noticeable, but I saw it. A fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. Rebecca stiffened beside me, realizing she had unknowingly invited a scandal much bigger than she anticipated. I smiled, slow and deliberate. What was her name? Yes. The other woman. The other child you left behind. Gasps erupted through the studio. His face went pale. I already knew the answer, of course. The moment my story went viral, people started sending me messages. One woman's email in particular had stood out. She had been 6 months pregnant when he disappeared on her. 2 women, 2 children, 2 shattered lives. And now the world knew. His lips parted, but no sound came out. There was no defense, no quick-witted comeback. Just a man unraveling on live television. You didn't come here to apologize, I said, my voice like a blade. You came here because your world is crumbling, and you thought you could control the narrative. I smiled, saccharine sweet. But you forgot something important. I don't owe you kindness. Thunderous applause erupted. He looked at Rebecca, desperate for an out, but she wasn't coming to his rescue. This was bigger than her now. This was history unfolding. Understood. The cameras followed my every move. I've spent years healing, I said, addressing the audience now, my voice strong, unwavering. I don't need his apology. And I don't need his presence in my life. I turned back to him. But you need something from me. You need me to forgive you in front of the world. To give you an easy redemption arc. I stepped closer. And you will never get that from me. Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. And then cheers. Loud, deafening cheers. He looked utterly lost. Defeated. The cameras had captured every second of his fall from grace. I turned toward the audience, holding my chin high. This story was never about him, I said. It was always about us. The ones who stayed. And with that I walked off the stage, leaving him behind. Again. Only this time he was the one left in the past. I walked off the stage with my head high, my pulse roaring in my ears, but I didn't stop. Not when the audience cheered, not when the producers scrambled behind me. Not even when Rebecca Langston's voice cracked through the speakers, attempting to regain control of the situation. I didn't care. This wasn't his story anymore. Security held back the press swarming outside the studio doors, flashes of cameras exploding like fireworks in the dim backstage hallway. I heard the buzz of whispered conversations, urgent phone calls, the unmistakable hum of a media storm unfolding in real time. And I knew, without looking back, that I had just rewritten history. Kept moving. Through the hallways, past the green rooms, toward the only person who mattered. When I reached the dressing room, I pushed open the door and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There, curled up on the couch, was my son, fast asleep. His small chest rose and fell in steady breaths, his fingers still clutching the action figure I'd given him before the show. He had no idea what had just happened. No idea that the world was changing, that the man who had walked away from him all those years ago had just had his last shred of dignity ripped away in front of millions. And I was glad. I knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. I had done everything for him. I would always do everything for him. The door clicked open behind me, and my best friend Lila stepped in, her phone practically glued to her ear. Her eyes were wide, a mix of awe and exhilaration. Sarah, she whispered, shutting the door quickly behind her. Do you know what's happening right now? I sighed, sitting back against the couch. I can guess. No, you really can't. She turned her screen toward me. The notifications were endless. Hashtag the mother who stayed was everywhere. Clips of the interview were already circulating online. Not just snippets, full segments. My words, my stance, my refusal to be silenced. It was spreading like wildfire. And my ex-husband, he was being ripped apart. The internet had already unearthed his past, found proof of his second abandoned child. The other mother, her name was Olivia, had come forward just minutes after the segment aired. News outlets were already contacting her. His career, his reputation, his entire existence as a public figure, shattered in an instant. You destroyed him, Lila breathed. Without even trying. I looked down at my son again, at the peaceful rise and fall of his breath. I hadn't wanted destruction. I had wanted justice. And now I finally had it. The next few days were a blur. Barely slept. My phone never stopped ringing. News stations wanted statements. Bookstores reported that my memoir had tripled in sales overnight. People, women, from every corner of the world flooded my inbox, sharing their own stories of abandonment, of betrayal, of finding strength when they had been left behind. And my ex-husband, he vanished. No press statements, no attempts at damage control, just silence. I didn't need to see the fallout to know what had happened. The same industry that had once praised him, that had built him up, had turned on him. He had no allies left, no sympathy to spare, because this wasn't just about me. It was about every woman who had been told they weren't enough, every child who had been left behind, every single parent who had fought tooth and nail to make a life from the ashes someone else left behind. He had walked away from us once, but this time he was the one erased. A week after the interview, I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I began to type. A new blog post. To the man who left us. You once told me that having a child would ruin your career. And for a while I believed you. For a while I thought your absence was my downfall. But I was wrong. Because your departure wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning. And now, years later, here we are. You have lost everything. And I have a life filled with love. I have a son who knows nothing of regret, only resilience. I have a voice that will never be silenced. I don't need to forgive you. I don't need to hate you. I don't need anything from you. But if you take one thing from this moment, one lesson from this wreckage you created, let it be this. You left me thinking I would fade into nothing. But in the end, you were the one forgotten. I clicked publish. And just like that, it was done. Not for him. Not for revenge. But for every woman who had ever been left in the dark. So she could see what happens when we step into the light. And as I closed my laptop and turned to my son, who was now giggling over a puzzle on the floor, I smiled. Because this was the only thing that ever mattered. And we had already won. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.